Okay. Okay, can everybody see that?
Nope.
You can't see that. That's a problem.
Okay, so you should be able to share your screen.
I hit share screen.
Okay, and then you get a bunch of panels. Do you have your presentation open in the background?
I have it open right now. Yes.
Okay.
My wife is actually pretty good at this.
No.
Okay.
Oh, no, you're not there. Back to,
Okay.
go back to.
What?
Share screen.
I hit share. This is share screen. So I figured this might be a problem.
We should probably have tried it out ahead of time. Sorry.
Share.
Yeah, try that.
Did that work?
Yes, that worked. Now
There you
you
go.
click down and click the little projector icon down at the very bottom. Good.
Okay. How did that work?
You got it. It's there.
Oh,
Excellent.
miracles do happen. Hold it. She's figuring out how to.
Yeah, we're seeing a horrible picture.
Of people,
What are you doing?
horrible
I'm
conditions.
trying to get rid of all of these people here.
Or we don't care.
Well, you go up to do that, you go up to view and
Right.
click just stay side by side speaker or whatever.
I'm happy to have pictures of all of you.
Okay.
The view, just a second, one. Just
We gotta go.
Okay.
Go back to the beginning.
Okay, there. All right.
There,
This may
perfect.
not be ideal, but you can see it, right?
We can. It's
Everybody
great.
see
Thank you.
all of those pictures.
Can everybody? Well, I don't care. I mean, as long as you can see the PowerPoint, that's all that's important at this point.
We can see it.
Unless you have a 6-year-old who can obviously solve the problem. Well, a starving man does not sniff his food is a quote from a Ukrainian adage, which is, I think, just summarizes what we're talking about. You know, when people starve, they just don't eat what they normally eat. Okay, and you know, food. There's a lot of scholarship on food, and so I just went to Amazon and clicked Mexican cuisine foods, Italian, French, Chinese, British, 6,000, unbelievable. Anyway, and you can see there's lots. And now if you look at famine foods, frankly, I think whether it's any good or not, the book that I just published is the only comprehensive view of famine foods, which is odd because I'm going to try to argue that famine foods are incredibly important. Yeah, we love Mexican cuisine, we love Italian cuisine, but when you have an existential threat of food shortages, what you eat makes you survive. And frankly, a whole lot of you are probably, including myself, are probably here because some of our ancestors were able to eat famine foods. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So there's the famine food book. There are some regional studies of famine foods. There are articles about particular cultures, but this is the only one that I know of that's a comprehensive, an overview of famine food use. There's also a wonderful database that Robert Freeman, who also lives in Tucson, has put together over a long period of time. That's on the Purdue webpage, that he has 1,600 famine foods discussed. And you can learn all kinds of weird stuff. Everybody recognizes this, which I think most people would vote as the most loathsome weed in Arizona. Puncture vine or goat's head. We hate it. If we have dogs, we hate it. If we have bicycles, we hate it. If we walk barefoot, we hate it. But what we won't realize is that this has been a major famine food that has saved thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. It's a major famine food in India, China, and West Africa. In fact, during one Indian famine, this is recognized as the primary famine food. Believe it or not, the nutlets can be ground down into a flour that doesn't have much nutritional value. Evidently, according to the FAO, they did a nutritional analysis, and the greens actually are incredibly nutritious, believe it or not. So there's all kinds of things you wouldn't expect we can find when we study famine foods. Okay. Now, if we talk about famines, the one that comes to mind is the Angortamor, or the Irish potato famine. There's been a lot written on it. As I say, some of you were here because of the Irish potato famine. About 1 million people died and 1 million people emigrated to US, Canada, Australia, and other places. But it was hardly the worst that ever existed. famine foods can be very lethal. Probably the very worst was the Chinese Great Leap Forward famine from 1958 to 1961. Somewhere between 15 and 33 million people died. And there have been some estimates up to 45 million, though most people don't discount that. There are some people who have tried to estimate how many human deaths there were post 1860 and the 77 largest famines. And it's between almost 100 and 150 million people. And another estimate is cumulative deaths during the 20th century is 75 million. Famines are lethal. They're serious. They have long-term consequences. They're very common, and there's no part of the world that hasn't had very serious famines. Some are at various points in time. Some areas of the world have worse famines than others. And famines are not the only kind of serious food shortage. There are hunger seasons, which are very common in societies where stored foods or natural foods get low, and people simply just often lose 8 or 10% of their body weight and wait until more food is available. And then there's a smaller scale food shortages. So there are lots of food shortages, and famines are only the worst. Because famines have really an existential threat to humanity everywhere, and in millennia, you'd expect that there would be a large number of foods that people knew had figured out they could eat during famines, because it's such a serious problem. We don't know how many there are. Robert Freeman's database has 1,600, but I think that's just a small fraction that are known. I wouldn't be surprised if the number of famine foods is equal to or more than the number of known medicinal plants. And the Kew Garden has a list of 28,000 medicinal plants, recorded medicinal plants. And so we have a very, very tentative understanding of famine foods. There's just probably a lot out there we don't know about. Now, in terms of studying famine foods, it goes back a long time. Galen, for example, wrote about Asian minor. You can read the quote. And it's not very specific, but unfortunately, a lot of the historical discussions of famines in the 18th and 19th century and the 20th century are about this specific. My favorite old study is the Zhuang Ben Cao. Prince Zuzu in the late 1400s, and his son and others continued working on it, and they produced this famine relief herbal, which lists 440 plants that can be eaten during famines. It's just the most amazing famine herbal. And in fact, it has been reprinted. This is a modern edition of it, which all you can read. And okay. So my argument is, and I think is a clear argument, famines have a long part of human history. And if people didn't have solutions, and one of those solutions is famine foods, many people would die and we wouldn't be here. And so what do people eat during famines? And there's a short answer, and we could stop here if you want, and that's basically anything that's edible and many things that aren't. Pets, zoo animals, corn cobs, weeds, soil, other people. Lots of examples of that. But there's a longer answer, and that's complicated and contingent on history, environment, social organization, and economy. So the simple answer really hides a complexity that really we should study. But what's the definition of a famine food? And I think there are two ways that people look at it. The first is foods eaten during food shortages. And then the other are foods only eaten during food shortages. And I like answer A because it gives us a better understanding of how people, I'm trained in the social sciences primarily. I'm interested in people primarily, and how do they react and how do they use these plants? And to do that, you need to look at all the foods eaten, not just foods that are only eaten during famines, because there are a lot of different kinds of famine foods. And the ones that you tend to think of as famine foods, like relief supplies or native plants that are known to barely be edible, like a puncture vine, or native plants that aren't known, or mimic plants that are known, and tabooed plants. So those are the kinds of things that people think of, I think, as famine foods, but there are others. People can have increased or atypical use of crops. It's not uncommon to eat green fruits, for example, before they get ripe. Seed stock, for agriculturalists, one of the worst thing they do is to eat seed stock. You're basically eating your future. Animal feed is often eaten. Agricultural refuse and byproducts, which I'll talk about, is another thing. And then often just increasing eating native plants that they might eat normally as an adjunct to crops or other things. So there's lots of different kinds of famine foods, and the kinds that people use often depend on the kinds of circumstances they're in. If you take Freeman's database, and this is what I'm going to use as the best database, how is it distributed in the plant kingdom? And out of his 1,600 famine foods, which are in 190 plant families, and here are the numbers by the families that have 20 or more. And so you can see the bean family, as you might expect, is really outstanding and gets down to a lot of other families. What's interesting is, to me, in my mind, is that 40% of the recognized families, the 400 and something recognized families, 40% of them have at least one famine food. And so they're very common, and they're spread throughout the plant kingdom, though some families, like the ones you see here, are greater constituents of famine foods. And what parts are eaten? I took a 10% sample from Freeman's database and worldwide sample, and fruits, leaves, and seeds, as you might expect, are the most common. Tubers and roots are less so. I was sort of surprised. Shoots and stems aren't very common. Bark isn't very common, and other things like flowers are not very common. So really, fruits and leaves, and to a degree seeds, are, as you might expect, are the most important kinds of famine foods on a worldwide basis, though there is variability in different areas, which I'll talk about when I get to the Southwest. Now, what I did is I couldn't deal with all famine foods, so I took 14 case studies in the book. Hunters and gatherers like the circumpolar area, northwest coast of North America, the San of South Africa, Southern Africa, and the Australian Aboriginal groups. And then agricultural village farmers like the Southwest, the Gwembe Tonga of Africa, and Highland Papua New Guinea. And then nations, and things like India and China and Ireland are examples. And then I looked at cases during World War II, which I thought was particularly interesting. I looked at Greece, Netherlands, the siege of Leningrad, and the Allies in the Pacific. And so there's a wide range. It's just a sample of 14 case studies. And some of these are some of the best that I could find, the best documented cases that I could find. And so let's just look at some of the things that are kind of stand out. For the San of Southern Africa, previously known as the Bushmen, and Aboriginal Australians, compared to other groups, resins tend to be particularly important. Resins are not used very often, or not recorded as being used very often as famine foods, but they tend to be a little more common and important famine foods in these hunting and gathering groups. In the northwest coast of North America and the circumpolar region, interbark cambium is very important, common famine food, as are berries, particularly in the circumpolar area where there's really there's a depauperate flora. Interbark is particularly important. Interbark is used in a lot of areas other than the tropics, including the Southwest, but in the northwest of North America, like British Columbia and such, and circumpolar regions, interbark is very, very important. When we get down to village agriculturalists like the Gwembe Tonga or the Highland Papua New Guinea or the Hopi, for example, in Arizona, weedy plants tend to be very, very important, as you might expect. And then when you get to industrial societies, mostly urbanized societies, industrial and agricultural refuse tends to be particularly important. Corn cobs, for example, are often ground up. They have almost no nutritional value as is, but they give a sense of satiety. They fill people up. And so there are lots of examples, particularly in China, of people grinding corn cobs. The upper photo is from the siege of Leningrad, and these, I believe, are cottonseed cakes that are about as delicious as they look. And then the bottom photo is of tulip bulbs. And interestingly enough, if you look at Holland during the Hunger Winter of 1944, which was a short but serious famine, about 25,000 people died in Western Holland just before liberation by the Allies. Ornamental bulbs were really important. and tulips in particular. They would grind up tulips. Now, it makes perfect sense. You know, the annual bulb market is production is great in Netherlands. You can imagine during World War II, there wasn't a great market for these bulbs, and people sold tons and tons of tens of thousands of tons of these bulbs, particularly tulip bulbs, were eaten. So there's an example of a very unique economy in Netherlands during the Hunger Winter, and how they adapted their economy to it. And so these are very, very common things. Often with nations, you get organizations that develop new foods or artificial foods. For example, in the siege of Leningrad, there was the Bureau of Applied Biology, Botany, which came up with all kinds of recipes. And there are other examples as well in India where they made fake rice and a few other things. And so this idea of making artificial foods from agricultural industrial refuse is very, very common. So let's compare. Let's go to the Southwest. Why not? And NA is North America in general, Southwest and Northwest. I worked in Northwest Mexico, so I don't like saying just the Southwest, Southwest and Northwest Mexico, and then that worldwide sample. And you can see there's variation. So for example, leaves and greens in North America in general are not very important, whereas worldwide they're quite important. And the Southwest is in between. In terms of roots and tubers, the Southwest is more like the worldwide sample than in the North American sample in general. And in shoots and stems, it's the Southwest is more like the North American sample than it is the worldwide sample. I think because a lot of cacti are listed as stems. I can't remember for sure. So this just, I think, shows that there's variability. So while there are general patterns of what's important in particular regions or areas or cultures are variable. So I'm going to show these two slides. I don't want to spend a lot of time, and you're going to get mad at me for not doing it. These are just some of the foods listed as famine foods in the ethnographic literature for the Southwest. And they range from all kinds of things. If you wanted more about it, you can read the book. I also have a longer article in 1991 in the Journal of Ethnobiology on famine foods of the Southwest. Anyway, there are over 50 or 60 plants that are known, and there's an interesting historical reason that you have a lot of these are famine foods, which I'm not going to talk about. It's a tangent, but you see there are quite a few. Cacti account for about 17% of the recorded famine foods. Perennials, about 38%, including underground parts, various things. Agaves and related plants like Nolina or Dazzlerian, about 10%. Inner bark counts for about 7%. There are a number of trees in the Gila Forest and other places that have the scars from the historical Apache groups cutting the bark to get the inner bark of the cambium, which is actually a very nutritious thing. And then annuals and weeds are very, very common, which is kind of strange for the Southwest because you'd think what would cause food shortages would be dry conditions. And under dry conditions, you think weeds and annuals would be less likely to be abundant. But that's not the case. And there's an historical reason. As an archaeologist, I study plant remains from archaeological sites, and a lot of the plants we see listed as famine foods were probably more common foods in the past, in the ancient past. And with the changes that occurred with the Spanish coming in and bringing livestock, bringing different kind of agriculture, different kinds of plants and orchards and things of that nature, plants that in ancient times were sort of standard seasonal foods or supplemental foods became famine foods in the historical record. And I think that explains why weeds and annuals are so very common. And then there are others like on the coast, the Seri use eelgrass, and the piths of palms can be used in Western Arizona and California. So that's what the Southwest has. And it's about, again, to understand this, you need to understand each individual case study. So that's all nice and good, but what's its use other than the obvious that you're listing plants that people could eat? By the way, the picture of that plant, that's charlock, which was probably the most important non-relief famine food during the Irish potato famine, the Angora. It's listed as a very, very important plant that kept some of your ancestors alive. Well, one of the advantages, I think, is to reimagine crops sometimes. If you look at famine foods, there are things like we think of eating beans, but bean leaves and bean stalks are often, stems are eaten as famine foods. Same thing with cucurbits. And as I mentioned earlier, corn cobs. Corn cobs have so little nutritional value. But, you know, there is some biochemists who've been able to change corn cobs and produce edible starches, human edible starches from corn cobs. And so we need to kind of maybe broaden our view about crops, I mean, and how they were used. A lot of famine foods take a lot of processing, and so, or maybe poisonous unless they're processed. And you might think that would preclude them from being used more commonly. But, you know, yucca or manioc is a poisonous plant. Well, there is bitter varieties are poisonous and require significant processing, and yet that plant has become a staple for poor people throughout the tropics for tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in the old and the new world. And so the fact that something is just poisonous or needs processing, that shouldn't preclude it of thinking about how we might be able to use it. And then, of course, the cross-cultural study of famine foods is an advantage because we learn about plants that we wouldn't think about. This is the example I gave you before of puncture vine or a goat's head. I mean, when I walk my dog, anytime I see this, I pull it up. I guess I could say that in a Native Plant Society meeting. And we would think it'd be horrible and have absolutely no use whatsoever. But again, it has saved probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, something that I think most of us wouldn't even imagine. Or if you're from the Eastern US, how about kudzu? That disgusting plant which eats buildings and trees and everything else. It's actually a major famine food in Papua New Guinea. The roots are eaten. And actually the roots are eaten in Southeast Asia as well. And so these are plants that these are just two examples in North America that we tend to think about as really loathsome, invasive plants that have no value whatsoever. They're just miserable things like mosquitoes, but they really have some value. And by a cross-cultural comparative study of famine foods, we learned about plants that we may have access to that we wouldn't even think would be edible. And so that's, I think, one of the advantages. And in fact, it's not just us in urbanized societies that if I asked all of you what you would eat, if there was grocery stores all closed down and your gardens all died, now that Native Plant Society people would probably be in better shape than most folks. Most people wouldn't have a clue what to eat because there's no record or oral traditions about famine foods. But even in areas adjacent, there are a number of examples of village agricultural communities that are right next to each other that have very different knowledges of what's edible during famines. And so people can visit another village and be surprised that something they have in their area is in fact edible if need be. And so it's a common problem. The biggest problem of all of this is I suspect that famine food information is easily lost. With increased urbanization, people moving to urban areas out of rural areas, and people doing more industrial farming, traditional knowledge of what you eat during food shortages is more likely to be lost than information about more commonly eaten foods. And therefore, it really behooves us to gain as much information as possible about these alternative foods. It's not very expensive to do. There is some hope. That study in the Netherlands, there's a wonderful study that they did about the Netherlands hunger winter. In fact, it's these botanists did it from the Netherlands, and it's the finest piece of work I've seen on the study of famine foods. And they not only went through records and talked to people about what they ate, and they came up with a list of 50 to 70, I can't remember the exact number of famine foods, but they went back 73 years later and talked to old folks who were young kids during the Dutch hunger winter of 1944. And these people were, really old at this point, in their 70s, actually more than their 70s. It was 70 years after the famine, the hunger season. And people remembered some of the stuff. People remembered what they ate. And they didn't remember all of them. So the study had lists of famine foods gathered from archives, diaries, government reports. And then they had the list of famine foods that these people remembered even after 70 years. And they didn't remember all of them, but they remembered quite a few. So there is some hope that this information will not be lost forever. Again, I'm concerned that this is information about foods that is very fragile and can be lost, especially with people losing that intimate connection with their local environment. So anyway, I view, as an archaeologist, I view knowledge of famine foods as a collective gift built over millennia of experiences of people learning what's eaten and what's not edible. And it would be a great tragedy, I think, if we lost this information, because it doesn't cost much to do. In order to do this, I found that the botanists who study this tend to be very precise about the plants, but imprecise about how people use them, as you might expect. The social scientists and the historians are very precise about the context of who uses them and how he uses them and how it fits in the social and political economy. But they aren't very good about this plants, how specific they are about plants. They talk about grass or weeds or bushes. That's not very useful. So the best way to have these kinds of studies is to have a biologist, social scientists, and the local community all collaborate so you get the best information possible. Anyway, that's it. And if you have any questions, let me know. Let me get out of here. Oh, I don't want that either, do I? You don't want my email, do you? Uh-oh. Well, anyway,
You need to stop sharing your screen.
new share. Oh, stop share. Huh, how about that? Okay. I told you I don't know this stuff. Okay, let me go up and see what the questions are.
Thank you. And I can follow the chat questions if you'd like.
Oh, why don't you do that and paraphrase them, and then I'll just answer them as best I can.
So, okay. So on the famine foods, I guess type B, eaten only during famine.
Yes.
Is there a trend for those items to be mildly toxic?
There are a number of reasons that foods are not preferred, if not loathed. One is they can be toxic or bitter tasting that requires processing, or they could just take a lot of processing, to get the food out. Some of the roots, for example, have a lot of fibers. The other thing is the plant may be a low density plant that is not worth in normal times collecting. But if you're starving, you'll take the time to collect it. So there are a lot of potential reasons. One can be toxicity. One can be, oops, excuse me. My computer is in low mode here. Okay, they can be toxic. They can be take a lot of processing just to get something edible, or they can be low density. The other thing, they can be taboo. People don't eat. There are all kinds of food taboos based on cultural and religious practices, and people. There are cases in India of high status women starving rather than eating tabooed foods. I think that's the exception. Boy, when you read about famines, they're horrid, and people are desperate to eat. And so there are a lot of examples of people eating tabooed foods because that's all there is. So those are a bunch of reasons why foods are low preference foods.
And sort of related to that, then there's a question about, as you mentioned, more time is required to process the foods maybe in order to eat them. And it seems like this might be a phenomenon that would especially impact women during cultural famines.
In societies where
anything
women
to
do most
add?
of the processing, yes. On the other hand, in famines, gender roles tend to be lost in the really serious famines. I mean, people are off just trying to eat. And so in most cases, women tend to have greater knowledge of particularly medicines. But in terms of famine foods, it's variable. There are examples where males know more famine foods, and other cases where females know famine foods. When it really gets really serious, everybody's out there trying to get food and prepare food. So I think gender roles in that regard, what we think as sort of common gender roles, are lost.
Oh, that's interesting. And what about, you mentioned you mentioned that inner bark and resin,
Yes.
and especially the inner bark. Well, how do you prepare that, or how is it eaten? Do people just scrape it off with their teeth, or do they?
No, you
do
can
something with
scrape it off and eat it, and you can dry it. There is, in Scandinavia, there is bark bread. And so if you Google Scandinavian bark bread, it'll give you a recipe.
Really?
Yes. And so anyway, mostly you take the outer bark and then you scrape off the cambium, and you can eat it fresh, you can dry it. And I don't know the recipe for a Scandinavian bark bread. Frankly, I don't want to eat this stuff. So, that's one advantage of saying famine foods. You don't want to eat this stuff generally. So there are a number of ways of doing it. And it's actually calorically, it's pretty good. It's a pretty healthy food.
Well, I guess animals eat it, deer
Yeah.
and rabbits and things. And then the resin, what would you do with that?
Mostly just chew it and eat it
Mhm.
without processing.
Okay. And then let's see, you categorize agaves and yuccas as famine food.
Yes.
What is different about how these items were used in normal times versus during famines? Were different parts of the plant used, or more processing done?
Well, there are several things. One is they could increase the amount that they eat. Okay. Second of all, they could use species that they normally wouldn't eat. There's some examples of, for example, I remember of the seri eating species of agaves, and I can't remember which they normally wouldn't eat, but they would eat them in famines. So you can increase it. I'm not sure about eating it in different ways, but you can, you might eat X amount of agave in a normal year, whereas in a famine year, you just increase the amount. That's why I think defining famine foods as not foods only eaten during famines, but foods eaten during famines is the way to understand how people interact with food during food shortages. And agave is just a wonderful example of that.
And can any seed be eaten? I guess
what?
this is the idea. Can any seed be
Seeds?
eaten? Mhm.
Seeds? Yeah, seeds are very common.
But I guess it's asking if all seeds can be eaten. I mean, it seems like there would be some that might be poisonous. I don't know.
I assume a large number would be not a good thing to eat. I don't know. But seeds are very common, and sometimes they require extra processing. And some seeds, like grass seeds in Australia, they may not normally eat because there's just a lot of chaff and not a whole lot of the seed itself. So I'm sure there are tons of seeds that that one couldn't eat biologically, but that's not. I was looking at what people do eat, not what they don't eat.
Yeah. And then when you refer to low density, what does that mean?
Well, you could during normal times, why gather something that there aren't many of, and it's going to take you a lot of time to gather? It's just not worth it. And but when you're really desperate for food, it's worth it. And so you could have a plant that is not very common in the environment that is edible, but if you put your effort into another plant, you'll get more calories and maybe it tastes better. But when push comes to shove and there's no food to eat, go for that low density, go for the plant that's not very common, because at least you can eat some of that. Did that answer
Oh.
the question?
Well, I think so. And then someone else further down wrote about the seeds, wrote hemlock seeds, no bueno.
Yeah, I'm, yeah, yeah.
And also castor beans.
Ask Socrates about that.
Yeah. And then I guess someone is wondering, during the potato famine, were there famine foods people could have eaten but did not?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I have in the book a list of probably 50 plants that were eaten. There's a modern book on edible wild plants of Ireland, and it has like 160 plants that are edible. And most of those probably were in Ireland in the 1840s. And so why is only 40 or 50 known now, where there are potentially 168? It could be that the people ate more of them, and it was that information was lost. That's possible. It could be that there are changes in the environment. You know, one of the problems of the Irish potato famine is that the economy, rich landlords are trying to get rid of the tenant farmers because they were going more and more towards sheep, and the tenant farmers were a hindrance. And it may be that the environment was more grazing and land, and there wasn't as much wild areas where you could have these native plants. I don't know. It's an interesting question, but my guess is if we know 40 or 50 plants that are recorded having been eaten, and we know nowadays there are 168 plants in Ireland that are edible, my guess is we're missing some, and there probably were some that we either were not eaten or that were eaten and we don't have historical records for, and I don't know which it is.
And then now this question is sort of a change of ideas. Are there any patterns as to who eats when food is scarce? How are famine foods typically distributed? Do men consume more than women? Are children given priority? Any insight into how meager resources are distributed?
Well, this is where context is important. That's a good question. This is where context is important, because when there are bad but not severe food shortages, there tends to be greater cooperation. When it really gets down to the very, very worst famines, kids are often sold, just to have fewer, particularly young girls are sold. So there are fewer mouths to feed. Often families break up, and it tends to cause social disintegration. Well, under the really, really most serious situations, where it's every person for themselves. And so, there's a general pattern in many cultures where, we think of kids as the precious resource you save, whereas in many cultures, you say the reproductive adults are the people who should, you lose some kids. If you have reproductive adults, frankly, you can have more kids. I mean, it sounds awful, but that's not an uncommon frame. So who eats and who gets food is often dependent upon how severe the food famine is. If it's not too bad, then social patterns of sharing sometimes kick in. When it gets really awful, it's terrible. And those social patterns of sharing drop away, and it's every person for themselves often. And often husbands leave their wives, and the wives are often stuck with some kids, and often the kids die. Women can tend to live longer under food shortages than males, but it all depends, again, how bad the situation is.
Gosh, it's just really something that we can't really imagine, I think.
Well, you should read a book by Colin, it's called The Mountain People. And I don't know how true it is, but it was a group in Africa. He studied a hunting and gathering group, and he thought they were just wonderful, back to earth folks. And then he studied the mountain people who were under a severe famine. And the people that survived were young girls because they could prostitute themselves, and young males because they were strong and could steal food from other people.
Hmm.
It's if you read about the really severe famines, it's
Oh.
horrible, absolutely horrible.
Awful. Well, here's some interesting information from Jesus Garcia about the
Oh.
corn cobs.
Yes.
He says in the book, I Rigoberta Menchú, maybe you already know this, an Indian woman in Guatemala talks about eating fermented corn cobs. They would bury the cobs and let them ferment, and that was common food for dogs. But then during the Central American War, they had to eat it themselves.
Boy, I'd love to have him send me that reference. What I have seen mostly, and this is heavily in China, is they just grind it up. And often what you get in industrial societies or places where you have agricultural refuse, often, for example, bread is adulterated. This happens a lot of places, Siege of Leningrad, Greece, Netherlands. They take a bread, but they add, 25% unedible fiber like ground up corn cobs or wheat chaff. I don't know what fermenting does. There are fairly complicated biochemical processes you can use to get edible starches for people. Corn cobs are used to feed animals, cows, for example, but they have a very different digestive system. So that would be a very interesting thing I'd like to know more about. If Jesus could send it to me, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, did you get that, Jesus? I guess, and then there's a couple other comments, and then maybe if people would just have things, that they would like to ask directly. There's a Martha Burgess put in the words Colin Trumbull, and I'm not sure what.
Oh,
that
Colin
means.
Trumbull. Yes, that's the forest
Is that a
people in the mountain.
well-known-
Yes, thank you.
Oh,
Yes,
okay. Oh,
he wrote the
mountain people. Okay.
forest people who he really liked, and then he studied the mountain people who he found really disgusting, and then he became a Buddhist priest. I don't know if they're connected.
And then there's a movie called Graveyard of the Fireflies, showing famine in Japan during World War II. A very powerful movie.
Yes. Yeah, there's so many examples. I focused on China because there's a lot of history of China, and a lot of the famine foods, especially the early famine foods in Japan, were in fact information from China. The Zhuang Bencao, for example, was just translated into Japanese. And so China was actually sort of the source of Southeast Asia famine food information. And there's a lot of information on China. Japan, that would be a wonderful example to look at.
And then here's I'm just going to do this final comment, and then I think, what do you think, Lynn, if people just want to ask their own questions?
Sure. I mean,
Does
there's
that seem good?
a
Give
raise
a little
raise
time.
your hand option, and people could do that if they
Okay.
want to.
Okay, but let me first share this also from Jesus Garcia. He says mesquite sap is the best. In Spanish called chucata, and Odom called ashap. I don't know about my pronunciation, but anyway, the amber color ones are the best, and many Mexican kids in northern Mexico grew up with that snack.
A lot of the resins, especially in Australia, and also I think in the South, are from legumes, just like mesquite. So that's just a pattern that's actually fairly common. And so I don't think we have mesquite sap as a famine food listed for the Southwest, but it would make perfect sense.
Uh-huh. And kids frequently eat things that other people don't.
Don't we
eat.
all?
I
All of us
know,
all of us parents are well familiar with that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. As a kid, I used to eat different animal foods, chicken
Right.
food or different things. So kids try things. So yeah, if anyone else would like to unmute and raise your hand, that would be great. You can't see.
Sounds like that's about it.
Yeah, I'm looking
guess
at the
so.
gallery and I don't see anyone with a hand raised.
Yeah.
So maybe we've covered it. So there, thank you very much, Dr. Minnis. We really
Oh,
appreciate it.
wait, there is one.
Okay, go for it.
Well, Deb Gaines. But Deb, you're muted. Oh,
No, I
good.
don't have a question. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Never
was-
mind.
Yeah, there's a comment here about wondering what knowledge is left in modern North America. Would you recommend we all go out and buy copies of Ewell Gibbons?
Well, actually, I reference Yale Gibbons.
I actually am not being facetious. He has lots of good information.
Yeah, as I say, in most industrialized societies, highly urbanized societies, there's a lot of famine food that's just nobody knows what to eat. And the closest source are foraging books or survivalist books. And Yale Gibbons is a clear example. And there are others as well. There are there are a lot of indigenous groups and First Nation groups that are trying to rekindle interest in their traditional foods. And there's a wonderful book by a Choctaw student who tries to talk about traditional Choctaw lifestyles and what they eat. There's also with native seed search, and there's a lot in the Southern Plains of reclaiming these crops and native plants. So there is information out there. It's not specific to famine foods, but the foraging foods like with Yale Gibbons, and there's that whole series from Timberland Press, Slattery's is the Southwest, that has 9 books on foraging in North America. And that's about the closest I think you're going to find to information on famine foods for North America, for the urban population.
Martha has a question. Martha Burgess,
Okay.
Would you like to unmute yourself? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Several of the things that you've mentioned, Dr. Minnis, about particularly Southwestern, I'm most aware of Tahana Autumn traditional foods. A lot of the things that you've mentioned as famine foods were sort of typical foods for the desert people. And but let's see, a couple of them that my most vocal mentor, Juanita Ahilbat, she would discuss jojoba nuts as being she called them desperation foods for desperate times, but she didn't want to eat them. I mean, it was mostly medicine. They'd clean out your system, but at least they'd fill your stomach, she said.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Well, and then another one that she called the famine food or desperation food was for the season where it's the leanest for the Tahana Autumn, around February. You've used up all your stores of wild foods and the cholla buds aren't ready yet, that kind of thing, and it's been a dry winter. You still can find barrel cactus fruits remaining right there on the tops of the barrel cactus. So she considered that one her desperation food.
Yeah, hunger seasons are really common with agricultural groups. I mean, that's really very, very common. As I said, a lot of, and I don't know, I just said, I just went to the ethnographies that listed famine foods. There's no consistent definition particularly, but of the ones in the Southwest, I was struck by a lot of the things that are now listed as famine foods were in the past common foods. And because I study plant remains from archaeological sites, and I find a lot of these things. And I think it's a function of the incredible changes that occurred with the Spanish. This is particularly in the Rio Grande area where the Spanish hegemony was much stronger, I think, than most anywhere else. And so so the knowledge of famine foods, I don't think is static. And I think the Southwest is an example of where you're getting a shifting with tremendous changes that occurred with Spanish occupation and hegemony. I mean, it really changed economic patterns greatly. And that affected, my argument was, foods that were sort of standard foods kind of moved down the scale of preference to being considered famine foods. That was my explanation, you know, take it or leave it, I don't know. Anyway, so the point is the history of famine foods. There's a history of, and food choices are not static. And you see that. I did a study, it found chili. I mean, you don't find any chilies, prehistoric chilies in the Southwest. And yet it's so important nowadays. And I think it's due to the changes that the Spanish wrought. So they're just incredible changes in food that we often don't think about. And it's not only the food, but also the productive systems, introduction of livestock, changes in ownership patterns, orchards, and those sorts of things that didn't really particularly exist in the past. So it's a tremendous change. And you ought to do a little study of desperation foods among the Odom. Be great.
In progress.
Oh, good. Thank you. Wonderful.
Okay.
This has been so interesting and enriching. Thank you. And it's got neat implications for our future too with climate change.
Very much so. And let's all hope we don't have to eat this crap that I studied.
Oh. And hey, Jesus, I see your hand.
Hi there. Well, just thank you again. Such a great and inspirational.
Hey, how are you doing? I haven't seen you in a
conversation.
while.
It's been a while. Yeah, thank you very much. So great. Yes, I wanted to just comment a little bit about the chucata, the mesquite sap. I mean, this is one of those things that to me, that's a flavor of my childhood. And in Spanish, it's called chucata, which means chucatoso, means something that sticks to your teeth. So it's eating a caramel without the candy, without the sugar, that you can savor it, enjoy it for hours sometimes by sucking in it and enjoy it. I mean, it's a very unique, earthy flavor. It doesn't have particular flavor. Highly recommended. When you're hiking around at the beginning of the summer, usually during the fourth summer is when you see the sap. And again, the autumn name that I've learned, they call it ushap. And ushap, you can go to the San Javier Co-op and ask for it during the season in a little teeny tiny jar. It's $10. And I heard it's very, very appreciated by the elders because people that probably grew up on that as well. So they actually buy it. They buy these little tiny jars for $10 worth. It's about maybe 5 or 6, maybe up to 10 little pieces of sap. And it's, you know, the amber color one, the nice looking one, not the black one. The black one is very bitter. You want to eat the amber color. And again, I mean, I don't pass the opportunity every time I walk by a mesquite and I see the sap sticking up, just eat it. I have maybe about a kilo right now in my house. I always have some.
Is that the only legume sap that's edible that you know?
No, I've eaten some from other occasions and it's not particularly great. I've also eaten sap from apricots and plums and apple trees. It's not as great, but when you don't have mesquite sap, that will do.
Cool. So we'll
you.
see all that. Every time we see somebody gnawing on a mesquite tree, we'll know they're Native Plant Society people, right?
Exactly. Thank you very much. That's awesome.
Good seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there are in the chat several thank you messages too. I always forget to mention.
And thank you.
those.
It's a topic that I, for 30 years, wanted to write on and had all these other things I had to get done. And so it was a great joy to be able in retirement to get to this book after I got a bunch of other books out. And so it was great fun, you know, so it was a passion.
Well, that's wonderful. And I meant in the introduction, I had planned, and then to thank also Gay Gilbert. She's and I are working together on programs, and she's the one who knew about your work and made the contact for this. So thank you, Gay. And
Thank you thank you very much,
That's it.
Susie. And thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Minnis, for joining us tonight. Remember that if you're interested, we're having a little get together at Molino Basin Campground on Saturday at 11. And watch your emails for our lecture for next month. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. So thanks to everyone and happy botanizing.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.